Thank you very much for coming to the seminar. My name's Kate Halliwell. I'm the Nutrition and Health Manager at the Food and Drink Federation. We're running the seminar jointly with Leatherhead Food Research, and the focus is partly around sugars, but around labelling, so FIC nutrition health claims requirements, and around sugars reformulation. We produced a guide with Leatherhead earlier this year, and I guess also the other focus is really, our target really here was looking at smaller businesses and maybe trying to help some smaller businesses think about some of the issues that are coming up. One other thing I wanted to just flag from a Food and Drink Federation point of view is that we're just starting to develop an area on our website which we're deliberately focusing on small and medium businesses. At the moment it's covering the areas that are listed behind me, and the idea behind that was to try and develop a hub really, so to put all of the guidance and relevant documentation for all of these areas together to try and stop that kind of having to go to different websites to find lots of different things. So it would be our own guidance, but we would also link through to Department of Health, to Food Standards Agency, and so on, as well as other organisations that we know have produced things that might be relevant. So an example here in reformulation, IGD we know has a guidance on reformulation for small businesses, so we would link to their resource if it's freely available, as well as to our own things. The link there would take you to that website. You can explore our website more broadly there, and if you were interested it would obviously also give you how you would join us if you were interested in doing that. But the purpose of today, so why are we here? Why did we decide to run this session? There are some of the headlines. I'm sure you've seen this type of thing. It's been going for a good, probably coming up for 2 years now. Surely means the focus is going to move on at some point. But sugars, it's all over the media. And that's relevant for a number of reasons actually. So that means that people buying products have seen these headlines, people in businesses have seen these headlines, and they don't necessarily know how to deal with them, how relevant they are to them, what that might mean. Does that mean you have to reformulate your product? Is it a great marketing opportunity because you can develop a product that meets this need? And of course it isn't just media that's fueling this. There's health charity calls on a whole range of issues, and there is a government programme. So at the moment Public Health England have started a series of meetings looking at setting reformulation targets across a range of categories. Now they'll be voluntary when they come through, but nevertheless I think you'll hear more about this going forward in the media. Those targets are due to launch next March, so undoubtedly there'll be a flurry there, but already actually we're seeing kind of media being fueled by even just the speculative, what those targets might look like, what they might be. So a lot of noise, a lot of impact potentially for business, and also I think a potential for confusion. And really that's why we wanted to put this session together. The purpose of the session, as I said, really was to try and explore it in a little bit more depth and hopefully try and unpick some of the confusion there might be. So the two areas we're going to look at specifically are labelling. Under the Food Information to Consumers Regulation, nutrition labelling becomes mandatory for almost all companies and products as of this December. There's also Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation, which has very specific requirements about what you can and can't say on pack, and it isn't always necessarily immediately obvious, and so we just wanted to have a little run through of what those requirements might mean in terms of what you can say and what would get captured by it that maybe, as I said, isn't as obvious immediately. And then, so that's going to be Helen, and then I'm going to hand over to Jenny, and Jenny's going to talk through the reformulation guide we commissioned earlier this year. And the reason we commissioned it was that we were aware that there would be some smaller companies who maybe have heard about this, maybe are thinking about reformulation, maybe they don't know, but they just like to know a little bit more about what that might mean. And so really this is an initial look at 3 categories that we know are high profile in this debate, to see if you were interested, what sorts of things you might have to consider before you could reformulate a product. We're really interested in any feedback on this either at the event or later on if you drop any of us an email, because it's something we can develop further. We can look at doing it in a different way, we can look at different formats, and we can look at different categories as well. As I said, there's only 3 currently in this document, whereas the PHE reformulation targets are looking at 9 categories of food. So I'm now going to hand over to Helen, who is our Chief Scientist, who is going to talk you through some of the basic labelling requirements.
Hello everyone. I'm going to go through some of the labelling aspects which are particularly pertinent to sugar. This isn't just about sugar reduction, this is just, and it could be fats, it could be fibres, all sorts of things. There are general principles which I'll cover and then give some examples which just highlight some of those principles using sugars as an example. And of course when we talk about sugars, there is this slight confusion. We all talk about sugar and what we're normally talking about is sucrose, but actually sugars are a much more broader category, and what you'll see is that some of the requirements relate much more to sugars in total than they do to sucrose, and also some of the things that are being highlighted as being issues, such as added sugars, aren't actually in the labelling provisions. So people might want to know about added sugars, but actually that's not something that the legal requirement for labelling highlights. So there is general food law, which is basically, all food law is really to protect consumers. So food law is not designed to help make marketing claims, it's not designed to give you a benefit over other people or those sorts of things. It is to protect consumers, whether that's in terms of food safety or understanding what they're consuming. And certainly the general food law under the EU Regulation and Food Safety Act are really all about not misleading people about the nature of a product. So if you had something that was called a kangaroo snack, that might be because it contained something to do with a kangaroo, or it might be because it was to feed to kangaroos, but you'd have to be very clear which of those it was, because otherwise you would be misleading people. The big piece of regulation that was formalised in 2011, which is why it's 1169/2011, was the Food Information to Consumers Regulation. And actually for all of the big companies, this has been active for at least the last 2 years. But actually there's a deadline that's coming up next month which impacts small and medium-sized companies, in that it now applies to those companies, whereas they were given a longer period of time to adjust. And if you think about it, food products can have a very long shelf life. They can easily have an 18-month shelf life for highly shelf-stable foods. So you had to have been planning to do this quite a while ago if you want your product that's all on the shelf on the 14th of December to be legal. And it's often surprising how few things in terms of the nutritional labelling, for example, have historically been required. You didn't actually require any sort of nutritional labelling prior to this coming in, which we've all become very familiar with it, but actually it wasn't a legal requirement. You had to put ingredients, you had to put various other things, but you didn't have to put detailed nutrition labelling. But in the UK, we're all very familiar with it. So under this Food Information to Consumers, there's a minimum font size required for the mandatory information. You can put additional information, not in this minimum font size, but for the mandatory information it has to be a minimum. The way that allergens are highlighted has changed, and there's some specific changes around fresh meat, but when we're talking about sugar, meat's not terribly relevant. So in terms of nutrition labelling on pre-packed foods, you have to declare what the energy content is, which is both in kilojoules and kilocalories, and the amounts of fat, saturated fat, carbohydrate, sugar, protein and salt, and they always have to be in that order. So if you are really keen for your consumers to first see about carbohydrates because you think that's most relevant for your product, you can't not put fat on because you haven't got fat. You can't put sugars and carbohydrates first. It has to be in that order. You can additionally add on some additional nutrients if they are particularly relevant. So we've highlighted maybe fibre as being one that you would want to highlight. And you can add that, but again, you can't take something off to add something that you feel is more relevant. And then you can add on the voluntary information on the right-hand side here about the reference intakes. So on here, it's saying that the fat content is 3% of the reference intake for an adult. And it's always for an adult, and it's always based on a 2000 kilocalorie diet, although men tend to eat more and women tend to eat less, 2 pounds is about an average. So that's the format, and you have to have it per 100 grams. So that means that people can make comparisons between different products, but you can also have it as the serving size as well, which on this one is 40 grams. Very pertinent to the sugars bit with the carbohydrates. So this is the total amount of carbohydrates, whether they're simple sugars or complex sugars, i.e. complex carbohydrates. And then you have this second line, which will always be the same or a smaller number of which sugars. And you cannot add added sugars or free sugar as part of this table. So that's what I was saying, that there's a lot of talk about. Really, it's the added sugars or the free sugars which would be helpful. This regulation came into force way beyond anyone starting to talk about any of these aspects, and so you cannot put it on here. You could put it somewhere else, but not as part of this table. And sugars is monosaccharides and disaccharides. So these are simple sugars. So it could be fructose, sucrose, glucose, lactose, all of the simple ones, and they would come in that category of which sugars. Now, additionally, we've all become very familiar with front of pack labelling, but again, this is not something that has ever been a requirement, and in fact is not part of the Food Information to Consumers regulation either. It is not a requirement, but a lot of companies have decided that this is helpful information, and so they choose to put it on. There is not a format in which it has to be done, but there are things that you need to comply with. So it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but there are certain things that you need to do. So you can either have a simple logo with energy, like this one here, or you can give all of the 4 relevant nutrients plus energy. What you can't do is you can't, again, say, well, I've got, this is a product that's got sugars in, none of the other things are relevant. You can't just give sugars and energy, and you can't change the order that they're in either. And all of this is to help consumers always do quick recognition. The whole history behind front of pack has been incredibly lengthy, and there's been all sorts of public consultations and research that's gone into it. And what the research has said time and time again is that the more similar the schemes are that are out there, the more likely people are to be able to use it easily and understand it. So this one, I would say, has become the most familiar format, either with the colour coding or without the colour coding. And the colour coding is probably increasing all the time. But again, colour coding is voluntary, as is any sort of front of pack labelling. And this is always done as per portion. So it's the amount that you would consume. And the cut-off levels that tell you what colour it can be are in the guidance that goes along with how to do this front of pack labelling. You can't make it up for yourself. It's quite prescriptive as to how to calculate it, and it's not easy the first time you do it. So in terms of nutrition claims, there's 2 sorts of claims really that I'm going to highlight. There's nutrition claims and there's health claims. And nutrition claims are really quite straightforward in terms of they relate to the nutrients in a product. So sugar is a nutrient, carbohydrates, fats, proteins are nutrients, and they all have to comply to certain things in terms of making some of these claims. So to be sugar free, then it needs to have no more than 0.5 grams of sugar per 100 grams or per 100 ml. If you want to make a reduced sugar claim, you have to reduce the amount of sugar by at least 30% compared to a similar product. So that may be a product that you previously had, but also you are required to look at other products that are in that category. So if you had a really, really high sugar product compared to everything else in the market and you reduced it by 30%, you can't make a 30%, you can't make a reduced sugar product because actually you've gone to the same level that everyone else was. And again, this is to help consumers understand where something is actually giving them a benefit. Now, before the regulation came in, you could probably reduce it by 10% and you could reduce it. But the decision was made through the negotiations of the regulation that 30% was a significant level, and to make such a claim you needed to reduce it by that much, which is quite a high level of reduction. And if you were doing it with fat, you'd still need 30% and so on. So that's the reduced one. Then you've got low sugar, so that's obviously not as low as sugar-free, but it's still quite low, and that's set at 5 grams. And then there's this one around no added sugar. So that's where you have not added any extra sugars, but if you have already got sugar in your product, so like a fruit juice for example, you also have to say that it contains naturally occurring sugars, because you're not adding sugar, but the product still might be 100% sugar because it naturally occurs in the ingredients that you've used. So those are some of the most popular claims, nutrition claims that are used with regard to sugar. And I will say that there are examples where people do not comply with these. If they don't comply, then the enforcement agencies, which are trading standards, can ask you to change it. They, especially for smaller companies, they'll often be quite helpful. They'll actually help you understand what you haven't done right and help you understand how you can correct that, either by changing the labelling or by changing the product. The other way that you can get a challenge is through Advertising Standards Authority. So they're not an enforcer, but if someone sees an advert, whether that's in print, on television or on websites, that is within the remit of Advertising Standards Authority, they can ask you to change it. And these are here for consumer protection, so it's important they are enforced. Then the other area is health claims. This is where you are linking the presence of something in the food with something beneficial for the consumer. So most of the health claims are in this function health claims area, and most of them relate to vitamins and minerals, things that we have known for decades and decades are good for us for various reasons. So it might be around, as on here, calcium is needed for maintenance of normal bones. There are a few risk reduction claims, but actually those are quite uncommon because not many of the dossiers that have been submitted have been accepted by EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, as being acceptable science. And then there's also health claims relating to children's development, which again there are not so many of. You cannot use a health claim that has not been put on the approved list. There is a long list of approved things, and you have to check that and see whether what you want to say is on that list. So because you think something is good for you, it doesn't mean that you can use that to claim. And also, if you are using a general health claim, so if you're saying this is a better for you product, you are going to have to relate that general health claim to a specific health claim which has to be on that list. And you have to exactly say what that health claim is, because if you change the wording at all, you may be upping the kind of benefit. You can try and reword it to make it more understandable. I will say most of them sound very distasteful to consumers, but everyone is in the same boat, let's put it that way. And there have been quite a few examples where people have tried to make it more understandable and have been asked to change it back to the original. So anytime you deviate, you are at risk of someone asking you to do it the way it was prophesied that it should be. Let's put it that way. So those were the areas that I was going to touch on. Obviously you've got general labelling, you've got nutrition labelling, and then you've got claims. It is quite a complex area. There is guidance, and we certainly have some documentation on how to do it. And I will pass over to our Leatherhead colleagues.
Thanks very much. Hi, my name's Jenny Arthur from Leatherhead Food Research. I head up the nutrition and product development team. My background is in marketing and nutrition, so I can understand that the marketers want everything, singing or whistles or bells, but as a scientist I can also understand what are the practical implications. So this is what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about the reformulation guide. What I want to start with is talking about the properties of sugar. It is really quite difficult because of the properties of sugars. Briefly touch on the regulatory frameworks, which I know Helen has gone into. Just talk over very briefly some of the challenges around understanding sugars and replacers. What are the options? Look at consumer acceptance. As that marketeer, I'm there going, yes, that's key. Taste is key to everybody. And then just outlining the product categories that are covered within the guide. So, starting off with the properties of sugar. Sugars are a multifunctional ingredient. You cannot just take them out. You can't replace one thing for another. There is no magic bullet. At the end of the day, it contributes to sweetness, which is probably what everyone knows about, but it also helps with flavour perception. It provides bulk, it provides texture, it provides mouthfeel. A cake wouldn't be a cake without sugar, a biscuit wouldn't be a biscuit without sugar. Very much it builds the building blocks, helps reduce the available water, inhibits microbial activity, also contributes to the colour and to the flavour. And at the end of the day, consumers buy products because they like the taste, they like the flavour, they also eat with their eyes. Okay, this is just looking at a cake. What does sugar do within a cake? It provides, the first four are all about the texture, the mouthfeel, the volume, all about aeration. Helps to maintain the quality, the shelf life, preservation. When we're talking about cakes, it helps with the whipping and the creaming of the mixtures. And if we go on to biscuits, again, we're talking about the aeration, we're talking about the texture. We're talking about the dough, how, for example, when you're making a biscuit, some of the sugar dissolves during the making process, some dissolves in the oven to give the volume, to give the texture. Also flavouring and browning as well. So as you can see, the properties of sugar are quite broad, and what you're looking for is options to do all these things. That's where the problem comes. So coming on to regulatory frameworks, just going to talk about a couple here. Important considerations when you're looking at different ingredients, you need to be looking at the additive regulation, and that's mentioned here, where there is guidance. So the additives looking at sweeteners and looking at substitutes for sugars, and the regulation will then go by product category, and there is guidance on the EU website which products fall into which categories. And also you have to consider where is that product being sold, because there is also guidelines on which additives can be used in which countries. And we have a large regulatory department at Leatherhead where we look globally throughout the world, and I work very closely, the product development team work very closely with the regulatory team in terms of when we're doing product development. Also looking at claims on packaging, which Helen went through and talked through the nutrition and health claims regulation. Again, if you want to say something, as all marketeers do, you have to adhere to nutrition and health claims regulation. Okay, moving on to the challenges in understanding sugars and some of the replacers. Very brief look at sugars. There are extrinsic sugars, so what's now being, there's the areas of the free sugars, which I'm going to come on and talk to, and the intrinsic sugars. So those are the sugars that are in the cell walls, so for example, fruits and vegetables. What are some of your alternatives? Well, there are sweeteners. You've got bulk sweeteners, so it says what it does. It provides bulk, and you use a lot more of these, but also you've got intense sweeteners, so for example, your stevias and your sucraloses. So those are some of your options. If we look at free sugars, this has come out from the Sugars report, but it's also been refined more recently in September this year by Public Health England to include vegetable juices, purees, jams, smoothies and milk substitutes. But on the white side, that is what is included in free sugars, and this is what is excluded. So you've got milk sugars that are naturally occurring in milk, sugars contained in the cell walls, so those are the intrinsic sugars we talked about before. Sugars in fresh, frozen, stewed and canned and dried fruit and vegetables, they're excluded, as are the natural sugars found in grains and seeds and cereals. And also at the bottom, Public Health England are working on defining and developing a set of guidelines for understanding and estimating the free sugar content in composite food. Okay, what are the technical challenges and what are some of the options? Sugar, as we've sort of talked about briefly, contributes more than sweetness. There are other characteristics. It's more by trial and error. It's more by using blends, using different combinations of ingredients to also and look at what options there are. So what are your options? You've got other nutritive sweeteners, which fructose, honey, agar. I'll always remember the bake-off when they decided to talk about sugar-free week. Yes. And I did hold my head in my hands at that point because they were allowed to use agar and they were allowed to use honey. You're still going to be having the same number of calories. It's still going to be contributing sugar to the formulation. Consumers' perception is better because it is perceived as more natural. And at Leatherhead Food Research, we do a lot of consumer research, and we've asked our consumers, and they do perceive agave and honey to be healthier. You're also going to have flavour changes, but you're also going to have cost and processing implications as well. So is it achieving what you want it to achieve? You can then move on to look at high intensity sweeteners, your sucraloses, your stevias. This will replace some of the sweetness, but it won't replace some of the bulk. So you'll then compromise on another thing that consumers are looking for is clean label. They want to be able to recognise what is in the ingredients list. There's also taste limitations. You need to be looking at blending high intense sweeteners. You can't just use them in isolation. It's working out what sweetener is most applicable for your particular product. And at Leatherhead, my team spend a lot of their time looking at individual products. How can they remove the sugar and what can they replace it with? And you also got to ask yourself, at the start of any reformulation, what is my objective? Is it to reduce the sugar content or is it to reduce the calorie content? And if you ask consumers, they would expect to see a calorie reduction in a reduced sugar product. Some more technical challenges: sugar alcohols, so polyols, these are bulk sweeteners. They replace the bulk in a formulation. Again, you're going to get that compromise in terms of clean label because consumers are not going to understand why you put it in there. Also, you can only use them in certain product categories. Going back to the additive regulation, you need to understand where they can be used, where they can't be used, and they can only be used up to 10% of the formulation in some product categories. Other ingredients that you could include are things like inulin, where this is an opportunity to provide more whole grain ingredients and fibres to increase the nutrition content. Sometimes in products we combine an intense sweetener with a bulk sweetener and with other ingredients like fibres as well. It depends on the product at the end of the day. I wanted to show you these. These are in the report. It's the functionality. What does sugar do in a soft drink? This is relatively straightforward in soft drinks. I would say it gets more complex as well. I'm going to go through dairy products and we'll go through bakery products. So it provides the bulk. The sugar provides bulk even in a soft drink. It helps with a fuller mouthfeel, otherwise you get a very thin drink. Helps with shelf life as well. We move now on to the functionality of dairy products. There are more things that sugar can do within those products. Again, we've got bulk, we've got mouthfeel, we've got texture. But for example, in ice cream, you want to have the increased sugar content produces smaller crystals within the ice cream, which then gives a smoother texture. So it doesn't have that gritty feel. And also, the more sugar in there, the lower the freezing point, the less gritty the texture as well. So if you're replacing sugar, you've got to think about all these aspects throughout. It's not only flavour, texture, colour, stability, shelf life, there's a whole raft of things. And then if we're going to go on to bakery products, and in the guide it talks very specifically about particular ingredients you can use or particular aspects of the functionality. So with bakery products here, again you need to go back to the regulation to understand that it fits within the fine wares regulation. Again, there's definite definitions of bakery products as well. Again, we've got bulk, we've got freeze and thaw, we've got preservation. If you're taking cakes, for example, that contain a lot of water, and the sugar helps with preservation. It helps with the kind of volume and the rise of the cake. And when we're talking about texture and viscosity here. Gel setting points, sugar also helps when you're trying to set the fruit pie fillings. You need a certain amount of sugar within there to help the pectin. So we take an example of a cake and a biscuit. Again, we need to think, what is the objective at the end of the day? You can replace some of the sugars with other carbohydrates, but you're not going to get a calorie reduction because they're both 4 calories per gram. If you replace some of the sugar with fat, you then could get an increase in calories, which again consumers are not going to be very pleased about. You could then replace some of the sugar with a bulk sugar replacer like a polyol, but again, you've got your clean label indications, you've got your possible having to put a laxative warning on a product, which you don't really want to do at the end of the day. And you can replace some of the sugar in combination with a bulking agent and a high potency sweetener, but again, you might have bitterness, and also people might not perceive it as natural. So those just give you some examples of what problems you might run into. Consumer acceptance is absolutely key at the end of the day. We run sensory panels at Leatherhead Food Research, and we also run consumer surveys, focus groups, and we run a lot of consumer research. Taste is key. It comes out as the top every single time. People are not going to buy a product if they don't like the taste. And as you can see, the functionality of sugars is so broad that it has real impact on taste and flavour. Sugar is the gold standard for sweetness, and small reductions, we have an innate liking for sweetness. Give babies sugar and they'll smile. We have an innate likeness. It doesn't work the same as with salt, with stealth reductions. It takes a much longer period of time because the threshold at which consumers can taste a reduction in sugar is much lower with sugar than it is with salt. You've got intensity, you've got profiles. Sugar, for example, sucrose has a very long-lasting effect, a long aftertaste, whereas sweetness have a very short aftertaste. Again, you're coming back to the labelling and the laxative warnings as well with some of the alternative ingredients. So just finally, to sum up, within the report they cover 3 product categories: soft drinks, dairy products and bakery products. So it gives you much more detail of kind of what I've talked about here. So that's it. That's me done.
Great, thank you Jenny, and thank you Helen.